the end of the time in LA, I flew to New York. The song Love Gun came to me in its entirety on the flight. Melody, lyrics, all the instrument parts, absolutely complete. It was amazing and rare for me. I stole the idea of a love gun from Albert King's version of The Hunter, which Zeppelin also nicked from for How Many More Times on their first album. By the time the plane landed, I was ready to record a demo. When I got to New York, I called a drummer I knew and went almost immediately to Electric Lady to record the song. By this point, I didn't need to do demos in less lavish studios. I could do them in top-end studios, and Electric Lady was my favorite. I used the same equipment and tape that other bands cut masters on. That worked out to be as much of a curse as a blessing. Sure, the demo sounded great, but with using quality studios for demos came the risk of demoitis. You get so locked into the version you record as a demo that you lose all flexibility when it comes time to record the track. You've worked out all the parts, and it's hard to erase them and let other people have creative input if they veer from the version you recorded on the demo. Then you're stuck recording a stiff version of the thing you already did. It robs the final recording of spontaneity. You're less open to suggestions for change because you already have a fully realized concept. Eventually, in the late 1980s, I stopped doing demos for all those reasons. The funny thing about Love Gun was that even though the album version was recorded as a facsimile of the demo, when we went to cut the album version, Peter couldn't play the kick drum pattern on the song. Once Peter cut the track, we had to bring in another drummer to play the extra kick drum beats Peter couldn't. We recorded the album at the Record Plant, another iconic New York studio. It was up near Times Square in what at the time wasn't a great neighborhood. When you entered the place at the ground level, the receptionist was sitting behind a glass window and had to buzz you in through a locked door. The window had shutters, and once through the locked door, you saw the reception area was separated from the hallway by another locked door. I can't tell you how many times I left the studio to take a break and walked into the receptionist's little office. She would close the shutters and lock the door and say, "Oh, Paul." I didn't fool myself into thinking I was the only one, but I was one. And it was terrific. Sure beat a coffee break.
Your lightning's all I need, my satisfaction grows. You make me feel at ease, you even make me glow. Don't cut the power on me, I'm feeling low, so get my high, shock me, make me feel better. Shock me, put on your black leather. Shock me, we can come together.
There was very little band mentality anymore. The other three guys drifted off to their own social circles, and we all had our own people telling each of us how great we were. Between their sycophantic friends and all the press, Peter and Ace began to believe they were world-class virtuosos despite mounting evidence to the contrary. When we argued with Peter over his songs, he'd say things like, "You just don't want me to do this because I wrote the biggest song," or "You don't want me to do this because I'm the best singer." And he constantly accused me of not having paid my dues, apparently because I hadn't spent a decade before Kiss playing in bands that went nowhere like he had. Both Peter and Ace were fucked up all the time. I'd seen plenty of functional addicts. Bob Ezrin had been doing a lot of coke and chugging Remy Martin while we recorded Destroyer, but the quality of his work never flagged. Bill Aucoin, Neil Bogart, and much of the Casablanca staff were on a slippery slope doing lots of drugs too. Drugs and alcohol were like a Ferrari. There's a split-second difference between being in control and being wrapped around a telephone pole. You're in control, and then you pass that line and don't realize it until it's too late. I hoped Bill would be able to save Peter and Ace, but that turned out to be foolish. Bill couldn't even save himself. If Gene and I tried to diffuse unpleasant situations by saying, "Come on, man, that's the drugs talking," Peter and Ace would respond by insisting they knew exactly what they were saying. Peter's insecurities got more and more crippling with the addition of drugs. The whole world was against him. One day in the studio, he exploded about something and smashed my acoustic 12-string guitar against the wall. There was a moment of deafening silence after that. During another argument, Gene snapped at Peter, "Peter, you're an illiterate idiot who can't read or even talk correctly and never finished school." "Yeah," said Peter, "and I'm in the same band as you." To this day, that remains the smartest thing I ever heard Peter say. For the Love Gun Tour, which began in Canada in early July 1977 after the album was released, we had a private airplane for the first time. We'd flown private only one time before when, because of a scheduling conflict, we had to take a tiny Learjet to get in and out of some out-of-the-way city. This was different. This was ours. It was a Convair 280, a propeller plane filled with odd furniture, almost like a flying junk shop. The pilot and co-pilot were Dick and Chuck, and our flight attendant was named Judy. Dick and Chuck fought regularly and often yelled at each other in the cockpit, "You asshole, fuck you!" It wasn't very reassuring. Once at the end of a flight, we landed, got to the end of the runway, turned around, and immediately took off again. They had put us down at the international airport rather than the private airport. Another day, I saw flames coming out of one of the engines mid-flight. I told Judy to bring Dick back to see it. He came back, looked out the window, and said matter-of-factly, "Don't worry about it." Then he returned to the cockpit. The whole operation was an accident waiting to happen. The tour itself, however, went gangbusters. We had to add dates in a lot of markets and recorded another live album, a live 2 along the way.
My granny said I was a hooligan, running around like a fooligan. I went down to the candy store. If I had a nickel, I'd buy some more. And I also said, yeah, oh, so bad, so sad, but it's true, baby. What can I do?
The first live album had helped to define our career, and a second would be a kind of bookend. In some ways, we were crazy to even try. Since 1977 was such an incredibly busy year, the Japanese tour took up most of March, Love Gun was released in June, and then a live 2 followed in November. But we weren't ready to go into the studio. We were squabbling over material, and even if we had been ready, it would have taken time to get into the studio.
In the morning I raise my head and I'm thinking of days gone by, and the thing I want out of life is I want you. I want you. I want you. I want you. You can run, you can hide, but you never get away. You can lie and laugh, but you know you're gonna die.
It seemed like a good idea. We'd done 3 studio albums and a live album, and then another 3 studio albums. Why not another live album? The problem was we had to fabricate a Kiss show for the album because we didn't want to repeat material from the first live album. The first one documented a standard set. The second one couldn't because a lot of those songs from the first 3 albums were still staples in our show. So now we had to create a Kiss show that didn't really exist, with the dynamics of a real show. Even so, it didn't seem like a big deal since we had a lot of great stuff. Detroit Rock City, Love Gun, God of Thunder. And once again, we enhanced the ambient quality of the live recordings so they replicated the bedlam of an actual show. The onstage explosions caused compression in the microphone, so again, we used recordings of cannons to make them sound right. And for the back photo, we decided to take a shot during sound check at the San Diego Sports Arena with all our effects shot off at once. Just blast the entire arsenal and have us all up on the hydraulic lifts. That never actually happened all at the same time during a show, but it was an authentic documentation of the bombastic feel of the experience. The second problem with Alive 2 flowed from the first. Using only songs from the second 3 studio albums, the new live album took up just 3 sides of a double album, not 4. What were we going to do? We decided to add a side of studio tracks.
When we finally went into the studio, Ace simply never showed up. We had to use other guitar players like Bob Kulick and Rick Derringer. Ace was more furious than ever.
There's nothing up my sleeve. I'm a man as man can be, as you can plainly see. Don't wanna see.
How could you do it without me? He raged. How could we? Because these other guys showed up. This wasn't the first, nor would it be the last of countless times Ace would turn his back on the band.
What you heard, we're alive. My love is too much to hold, too much to hold.
I wasn't keen on the idea. We recorded the tracks at the Capitol Theater in Passaic, New Jersey to give them a live feel. I had All American Man, which I'd written with Sean Delaney, but overall, the songs we came up with just weren't great. Any Way You Want It was a Dave Clark 5 song I'd always loved, and Gene loved it too. The original 1964 version is cataclysmic, just huge. Ours didn't come close, but we needed to fill up that final side of the record. Ace didn't play on any of the studio tracks except the one he wrote, Rocket Ride. Instead, we had to use Bob Kulick, who had auditioned for the band during the Cattle Call back in 1972 and with whom I'd remained friends. As the tour continued, we flew on with Dick and Chuck fighting in the cockpit. During the time Uriah Heep was opening for us, I constantly made eye contact with their keyboard player's great-looking girlfriend. I found out her name was Linda, and the day after the band left our tour, I called our tour agent and said, "Track that girl down." The next day, she was back on the tour, now traveling with me. This was rock and roll.
Kiss had conquered America. We had conquered Europe, and then in early '77, we went to Japan to play a series of sold-out shows at Budokan in Tokyo. We learned later that we had broken the Beatles' record there. We didn't know anything about Japan. When we landed there, we did the same thing that we did in England, which was to walk off the plane in full makeup and outfits in case there were any reporters. Well, that was a great plan, except that the Japanese customs officials didn't let us into the country because they didn't believe that we were the same people as those pictured on our passports. So we had to take the makeup off, pass through, and then put it back on before we went outside. When we finally emerged from the airport, there were about 5,000 Japanese fans outside. The Japanese promoter, Mr. Udo, had arranged to have duplicate cars, and most of the fans ran after the duplicates while we snuck out the back and jumped into other cars. But enough of the fans figured it out and came after us. I really thought we were going to die. There were just so many people crushing us. They were on top of the cars. They could physically lift up the car. It was major Kiss mania, like what you see in the Beatles' A Hard Day's Night, but bigger, because the cars were being rocked and rolled, and it wasn't just girls, but guys as well. We later learned that the Japanese fans felt a great kinship with us because of our makeup, which looked like kabuki theater makeup, but also like the Japanese superhero shows. In the same way that some of our early American fans were black because they didn't see us as either white or black, the Japanese took to us because they didn't see us as American or Asian. The girls in Japan were also wonderful, very willing, and very available. The interesting thing about Japanese women, in my experience, is that they have a little girl quality, a certain innocence about their sexuality. Coquette is a French word, and that concept just doesn't exist in Japan, at least as far as I saw. For instance, when Japanese girls orgasm, a peculiar sound emanates from them that almost sounds like a baby crying. Japan wasn't just another country, it was more like another world. Within the country, we traveled by the bullet train, the fastest train in the world. The Japanese fans, and especially the girls, would follow us everywhere we went. They would giggle, give us presents, and break into hysterical crying fits in front of us. Peter brought Lydia, his wife, with him on the Japanese tour, so outside of work, we didn't see much of him. Ace, on the other hand, was full of piss and vinegar. One night he knocked on my door and appeared in front of me drunk, out of his mind, in full Nazi uniform with his friend, saluting and yelling into my face, "Heil Hitler!" I have pictures. Ace knew how I felt about Nazi Germany. He knew that my mother had been in the concentration camps and that her whole family had been wiped out, but that didn't stop him. Many years later, during the 2001 Kiss farewell tour in Japan, drummer Eric Singer, who had taken over for Peter Criss at the time, jokingly started calling Ace Race Fraley. During one of our off days in Japan, the band went to a nightclub where we were met by a gentleman who introduced himself as Gon. He was stout and powerful and could clearly take care of himself. We didn't speak Japanese, so we relied on our translators. We went over to our VIP section, and within seconds, girls started to line up and pass by us and giggle. The man next to me was of some importance, I could tell. I learned later that he might be from the Yakuza, the Japanese mob. One of the girls in the crowd reached out, and we shook hands. Gon broke off the contact, spit in her face, and raged at her in Japanese. She cried and ran off. The translator explained that Gon was merely doing what he thought was proper. He was there to protect us, and she was not worthy of touching me. This was clearly a completely different culture. At one point, I got up to go to the dance floor, and security men followed me. Most of the Japanese are smaller than Americans. A Japanese girl might be 5'2". One of the girls, a beauty about 5'8", made eye contact with me. I immediately went over and took her hand and pulled her toward the dance floor. She smiled. I told her I wanted to go back to the hotel, but the music was too loud. All she did was keep smiling. We got inside the hotel, and I tried conversation, and then it dawned on me that she couldn't speak a word of English. It didn't seem to matter, though. We didn't need to talk. The next day, one of our security guards told me she was a famous Japanese television star. Right before commercial breaks late at night, Japanese television would show a shot of a beautiful, naked girl smiling into the camera. When we got back to America, our press office showed me a press clipping from Japan. There she was, smiling her smile in front of countless members of the Japanese press. The translator explained that the title of the article was My Night of Passion with Gene Simmons. I didn't mind. I was actually quite flattered. She was gorgeous.
I'm almost human. Can't help feeling strange. The mood is out. I think I'm gonna change. You're so smooth and tender, a living, breathing dream. I've got to have you, baby. Yeah, I'm listening for your screams.
The demand for KISS concert tickets continued to rise through the year, and being on stage continued to suspend everything around me. Performing provided pure escapism and joy and elation. In my everyday life, I could never free myself of my insecurities, and the increasing rancor inside the band left me feeling more isolated than ever. But as I walked up the steps to play the show each night, I shed all problems at the bottom of the stairs. I needed the crowd to love me. Nobody else did, not even me. It can be very lonely walking off stage when you feel like that, when so much seems to be missing from your life. By December of 1977, when we got back to New York, we had sold out 3 more nights at Madison Square Garden. After the first 2 gigs, the other guys met up with family or friends. I found myself sitting alone at Sarge's Deli on 3rd Avenue and 36th Street, eating a bowl of matzo ball soup. On the one hand, now that I was a rock god playing a block of shows at MSG, I assumed I had succeeded in making people envy me and wish they had been nicer to me. But on the other hand, there I was having soup in a deli by myself. That was a harsh reality to deal with. After the final MSG show, Bill Aucoin threw a party at a swank townhouse. I flew in a girlfriend from Detroit. Santa Claus was at the party, and I had never seen so many lobsters in my life. Hundreds and hundreds of them piled up on platters. They must have cleaned out the ocean for weeks. We still didn't understand that we ourselves actually paid for such things. George Plimpton and Andy Warhol came to the party. It was always interesting to see people from other scenes like that, artists, writers, entertainers. Oh, that's George Plimpton. But I didn't function well except in the most socially controlled situations. I didn't want to risk getting shown up. I was too self-conscious. I locked myself in the bathroom with a woman who worked at a radio station. When we finished, we straightened our disheveled clothes and I went back out. Andy Warhol approached me and said, "You should come down to the factory sometime and I'll do your portrait." I'm not cool enough to hang around people like that. I never went. Big regret on that one. I always wanted a gold record and I always wanted to play Madison Square Garden. I already had my gold album. On February 18th, 1977, we headlined our first show at the Garden, and it was sold out. It had been 4.5 years since I pulled up in front of the Garden in my cab to drop people off for Elvis's show. I had seen the Stones at Madison Square Garden, forged a ticket for that show, in fact. I'd seen George Harrison's concert for Bangladesh at the Garden. I'd slept outside Macy's in Queens to get tickets for that show. I'd seen Alice Cooper at the Garden. I'd seen Ringling Brothers Circus at the Garden. Madison Square Garden was synonymous with success on a large scale. Playing there was big stuff, really big stuff. I was so anxious before the show that I took half a Valium. The idea that I might be sluggish? No chance. The adrenaline high was so strong on a normal night, and this was homecoming in a sold-out Madison Square Garden. I probably could have taken several whole pills and still have gotten up on stage and then run a marathon in record time. Shows like this were still new. I wasn't yet used to the idea that we were this big. After playing 3 nights in a row at the Garden, I knew one thing. What I had thought would fix me had not. If all these people look up to me and see me as special and a star, shouldn't I feel that way? Maybe in theory, maybe while I was on stage, but success and fame and the change in the way other people perceived me hadn't erased whatever was wrong behind the mask. I had reached what I was after, and it wasn't the answer. Whatever was missing was still missing. The question was, what was missing? What was wrong? And just then, as the Love Gun tour wrapped up at the beginning of 1978, a funny thing happened. At what seemed like the peak of our popularity, and when being on stage provided the only respite from my emptiness and my non-existent home life, we stopped touring. In part, it was because we simply couldn't. Ace and Peter were deeply into drugs and alcohol and alternated between hostility and incoherence. When they weren't incapacitated, they caused headaches for everyone around them. We weren't speaking to each other. We couldn't stand each other. We wouldn't play a gig for more than a year. What do I do now?
First time we went to Japan, it was rather unique because we had convinced Pan American Airways to give us a 747. Now, you can imagine going to Kennedy Airport in New York and seeing your 747 waiting for you. It was renamed and painted the Clipper Kiss Special. Well, I mean, it was just unbelievable. And on top of it, we took all the press with us as well. So we had the KISS group and all the management people, as well as a lot of press. We filled up the plane with press to take them to Japan. There were a lot of things that happened around that. There was also a freighter, an air freighter, another Pan American 707 that had to carry the KISS stage. Now, the group had been on tour, and they had not seen this KISS stage before because it was built and designed by Kenny Anderson, who was the head of our production department at Aucoin Management. And it was put on a freighter to be sent to Japan so that when they arrived at Japan, they would see it for the first time set up. Well, a little quirk that happened at the airport in upstate New York was the set turned out to be a lot heavier than we had expected. So when they loaded it on the plane, we had to make a decision. We either had to leave part of the set home or we had to come up with another solution. Well, fortunately, the two pilots who flew it to Tokyo decided that they would fly the plane unpressurized and have to wear oxygen masks all the way to Tokyo so that the weight of the plane could handle the KISS set. Tokyo was kind of unique, unusual, obviously a completely different culture, but we had lots of fans there. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of fans at the airport. And we didn't realize that we were going to have a little problem at the airport. We actually put all our makeup on, on the plane, on the KISS, the Clipper Kiss Special. And when we arrived, they walked out of the 747, and there was a wall of photographers from floor to ceiling. They had put up ladders and chairs and everything, and you just couldn't even get by them. And as we finally got by the photographers, the customs people came to us and said, who are these people? We said, well, they're KISS. Well, no. This doesn't look like what they look on their passport. And, of course, we then had to go into a room and take off their makeup, which was really a hard job after just putting it back on again. And then they had to put it on once more to leave the terminal where there were thousands of kids waiting for them outside. KISS's Budokan concert was very successful, thousands and thousands of fans, and it was the first time that they were ever broadcast nationally by doing a television special directly from the Budokan.